democratization over the last three and a half years. And so we now see this much bleaker, darker assessment about democratic possibilities in the region emerging, and also a similarly bleak assessment about the capacity of Arab societies, and perhaps even civil society, to serve as agents of democratic change. It is true that in Tunisia they've played that role. Tunisia is a bit of an outlier in that regard. And because of this experience, questions that in 2011 looked like they might either be quite, or approaches to the study of authoritarian governments that looked like they might be quite dubious or perhaps a bit misguided, have now, I think, regained relevance and become important for us again in understanding what it is about these regimes that made it possible for them to reassert their authority over these mass protest movements that broke out in early 2011. And to provide just a few indicators of the extent to which the democratic potential in the region has not been realized, I think if you look at this very, very crude chart table showing the percentage of freedom by region according to Freedom House in 2014, the very, very low level of freedom in the MENA region, in the Middle East region, is quite striking. This is probably late 2013 data, in fact, but it's quite striking. 2% free in the MENA region, and keep in mind that Freedom House includes Israel in its coverage of Middle East freedom. So it might be even lower if Israel were not included. We see in that most important of political indicators, political cartoons, all kinds of images reminiscent of some of the earlier phases of authoritarianism in the Arab world, these pre-uprising notions of military leaders engineering elections as if they were military campaigns in order to ensure their own victory. You'll recall that in Algeria, President Bouteflika was elected recently, even though he is, for all intents and purposes, stuffed and operating on the basis of a motorized device inserted internally into. No, that's a facetious comment. But this says, vote for Bouteflika, alive or dead. And so I think, there is this sense that we are seeing widespread political reversals in the region, that what we're seeing, in effect, is the reassertion of very well-established patterns of authoritarian governments in the Middle East. That there's a kind of back-to-the-future sensibility about where the region is headed. But this is where I think it's important to be very, very careful, because I think we should not be assuming that the patterns of authoritarian governments that we're seeing emerge in the region today are, in fact, simply a return to the future, simply a reassertion of older patterns of authoritarian rule. I'd argue, in fact, that what we're seeing in response to the rise of mass politics are significant changes in patterns of authoritarian governments in the Arab world, and I'd point to two distinctive models of authoritarian governments that I see emerging in the period since 2011. The first is a model that I would characterize as, it's not a phrase I like very much myself, authoritarian upgrading 2.0, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And the second, which I think is far more troubling, is the emergence of what I would define as a kind of repressive, exclusionary form of authoritarian governance, which I think marks a significant shift from some of the earlier, more inclusive, more corporatist models of authoritarian rule that tended to dominate the region for much of the last half century. So let me say a bit about each of those models before I wrap up, and then what they imply about authoritarian governments in the region more broadly. But before I do that, I wanted to say just a little bit, and I mean a very little bit, about authoritarian upgrading and what it involves. Essentially, the term is intended to capture a set of tactics that I think we saw deployed by almost every Arab regime beginning in the 1990s, but accelerating through the 1990s and into the 2000s, as a response to the challenges to authoritarian governments posed by changes like shifts in telecommunications technology, by pressures for political reform, both without, by pressures for economic reform from within and from without. And the 5 elements of upgrading that I've identified are those on the board. These are some of the strategies, I think, that regimes adopted as they coped with the growing pressures of the late 20th century to adjust their styles of rule. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but what I think is important is that we see that they had significant effects. And I think we see these effects captured in this graph, and fortunately it's not a graph that requires 20/20 vision in order to appreciate the broad trends, because it's far away. But I think if you look from the 1990s over toward 2012, is a shift in the balance between closed autocracies and multi-party autocracies. We didn't see democratization take hold, but we did see changes in patterns of authoritarian governance that moved toward these trends that I characterized, or were in many respects a product of those trends that I characterized. So there were improvements in the quality of political life, but they didn't push those societies over the threshold from authoritarianism to democracy. And my own sense is that the uprisings in 2011 can be seen in many respects as a response to the failures of these tactics, or to their limits, to the limited capacity of these tactics to respond to the underlying concerns that were driving popular politics in the Arab world in the 1990s and beyond. And one particular set of limits, I think, stands out as a particular trigger of the uprisings of 2011, and that is, in particular, the social and economic effects of controlled strategies of economic reform that in every single Arab state tended to benefit very, very small groups of those who were closest to the regime and tended to produce quite significant categories of losers, especially among the social groups that had relied most heavily on regimes for support. And we can see the effects of these in the rising numbers of popular protests that were taking place in the region, in particular around issues of economic grievances, even in the period before the 2011 uprisings began. So this captures data from Egypt only, but that spike in 6, 7, and 8 is a clear indicator of growing popular discontent over patterns of economic governance by these authoritarian regimes. I think regimes largely failed to address these grievances in the period before 2011. I think they clearly tried to do so in the period since. Although they've done so through slightly different strategies, as I've suggested, I think these strategies have quite a bit in common. And I think these strategies are, broadly speaking, producing these 2 broadly defined models of authoritarian governance, which certainly have linkages to the past, but I think are also contain significant new elements. On one hand, we've seen major efforts on the part of Arab governments to buy out popular support, to increase subsidies, to restore redistributive programs. And what this graph shows is how for 5 countries, well, I sort of don't think of Lebanon as quite the same category, but how 5 countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan, dramatically increased the levels of public spending in the immediate post-uprising period in an effort to mitigate the economic grievances that were driving those protests. And I think that was a generic strategy that virtually every Arab regime adopted, except the Syrian regime, which took a different course in responding to mass protests. But beyond this, there have been these 2 broadly different directions in which Arab regimes have moved in coping with the resurgence of mass politics. In a small number of cases, including Morocco, Jordan, and some of the Gulf states, I think regimes have largely sustained the tactics I've characterized as authoritarian upgrading. They've introduced limited constitutional reforms from the top down. These have had largely cosmetic effects. We could see that in the elections in Morocco in November 2011 and the elections in Jordan in January 2013. Neither of these elections had any discernible impact on the distribution of political power in the country. Alongside of these political reforms, though, even though cosmetic, these regimes have also expanded the more repressive aspects of authoritarian upgrading. They've more sharply constrain civil societies in virtually every country that experienced protest. We've seen new laws, new regulations put into place that clamp down on civil society activity. They have expanded controls on media and on communications technology. They have moved to further shift their economic and diplomatic ties away from the West. So I would argue that these regimes have not, in the face of mass protest, abandoned the tactics of authoritarian upgrading. What they have done is try to adapt them to respond to the very distinctive challenges posed by the resurgence of mass politics. There's a second set of cases, however, including Egypt, Syria, and Bahrain, where we're seeing a different and much darker response. We're seeing variants of authoritarian governments that are moving in a much more repressive, much more exclusionary direction. Syria, I think, stands out as the most extreme example of this. But in each of these cases, regimes have moved very sharply to constrain political contestation. They've moved to reshape and to narrow the social coalitions on which these regimes depend. Their predecessors were actually engaged in expanding the social bases of these regimes. That has been reversed to a significant extent. In the Syrian and Bahraini cases, these processes have taken on an explicitly sectarian quality, which I think is especially troubling in the sense that it deepens sectarian polarization. It brings identity politics of a very dark kind right to the center of regional politics. And we also see in all three of these cases increased efforts to reorient their foreign policies, their diplomatic strategies, their foreign economic policies, even further away from the West and to tighten their ties to authoritarian allies of different kinds. This has taken different forms. In Syria, the key authoritarian allies have been Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. If Hezbollah occupies that standing, in Egypt it has been much more Russia and Gulf states, different configurations of Gulf states. But in both of these cases, relying on these authoritarian allies has provided really critical sources of diplomatic support, of financial support, of strategic and often military support. I think in the Syrian case, it's safe to say that these relationships have really been essential to the regime's survival. And one of the things that's important about this from the perspective of democratization and thinking about the future of democratization is that if we take seriously the idea that factors like leverage and linkage, the density of the ties between governments and international actors which are democratic, expand opportunities for democratization, the narrowing of those ties and the tightening of links between these exclusionary, repressive authoritarian regimes and authoritarian allies makes the possibilities for democratic change even more remote, because it reduces the influence that might emerge through net channels like leverage and linkage. And so we really, I think, have to recognize that for those of us who care about the democratic future of the region, or democratic potential of the region, this very broad reorientation of economic, strategic, diplomatic ties is one of the core obstacles to future democratization efforts in the region. In general, though, I also think that we have to recognize that one of the critical outcomes, perhaps the essential outcome of the Arab Spring with respect to the Middle East and patterns of governance in the Middle East, is that the Arab Spring has accelerated processes of authoritarian transformation and has further pushed the region along these two different pathways that I've been describing toward much more repressive, much more exclusionary, generally much more insulated forms of authoritarian rule that I think have some significant potential to become consolidated, to establish themselves, and perhaps to persist for an extended period of time. And I think that's a very salient conclusion for all of us who looked at the events of 2011 as holding enormous potential for significant democratic transformations in the region.
Thank you very much, Steve.
That was good.
Chairman? Okay, sure.
to thank the organizers of the panel for inviting me to participate in this event. As someone coming from another university that has a G in its name in the district, let me offer my own and also that of my colleagues. Congratulations to the Center for its work and its persistence. The 10-year anniversary is significant in any endeavor. Thinking about the subject at hand today, democracy 25 years on, has for me coincided in a very nice way with one of my recent activities, which is redoing the introduction to a textbook on Central and East European politics, which I co-edited with Jane Curry of Santa Clara University. We published the first edition in, I think it was 2006. The second was in 2011. And now, of course, this will be the 2014 edition. The covers of these books are significant. The first one was a picture of protesters on the Maidan in the 2004 Orange Revolution. It was a great picture that, in a sense, was optimistic, but it had sort of dark undertones to it. It was taken at night. The second cover was one which my co-editor said would make anybody buy this book because it made Central and Eastern Europe look like Disneyland. It was a very artistic picture of the Charles Bridge and kind of twilight and night sky, and had yellow edges around it. It looked very promising and optimistic. We're kind of puzzled as to what photo to put on this edition. Right? I think we're probably going to use one from the Maidan that has a picture of Ukraine that says in Ukrainian, Ukraine, it's Europe. We'll see if it remains Europe. But in any case, thinking about that new edition and this task today coincided. And those thoughts highlighted a few issues that I think are relevant to what we're talking about today. The first thing that really struck me was the extent to which democracy was the goal of most, although not all, of the leaders of the post-communist states right after the end of communism that emerged not necessarily from the Soviet Union, but in what we call Central and Eastern Europe. And those are terms which I'm sure most of you know are each very controversial, where Central Europe is, where Eastern Europe is. For our purposes, we took a very simple answer. We adopted a simple answer to this question, which was to look at all of the states between what had been West Germany and the then Soviet Union that had communist governments, and we added the Baltics and Ukraine because they seem to be making promising strides toward establishing democratic systems. So, democracy was the goal, one of the three big goals. And you saw it in the election statements of almost all of the parties that took place in those first three elections. The other two big goals, of course, being recreating the market and back to Europe. The second thing, of course, that's important is that having a goal doesn't mean achieving it, at least not in the short run. And what we've seen in the last 25 years, and I would say this trend has accelerated in this region,